The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. Read by Chiara Colandagelli. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particularly portion of it. With every minute and eager attention the words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but, I know not how or why it was, its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed me. By slow degrees these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame, and the resemblance of my former deed of cruelty. Preventing me from physically abusing it, I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it. But gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its presence. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, as like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its lonesome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at loss how otherwise to define it. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of a white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of the hideous, of a ghastly thing, O mournful and terrible engine of horror and crime, of agony and death. Neither by day nor by night I knew the blessing of rest any more. During the former the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, internally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and all mankind. While from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outburst of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me into madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal, had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife, goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal. I withdrew my arm from her grasp, and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself, forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from my house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from my house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls, a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up, made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point. Insert the corpse and wall the whole up as before. so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly, and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it, at the moment there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed, the violence of my previous anger. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep, the blissful sense of release which the absence of the detested creature occasioned. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since the introduction into this house, I soundly and tranquilly slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me a little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the place of my concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. For the third or fourth time they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle, my heart beat calmly, as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my chest, and roamed easily and to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied, and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was so strong, to be restrained. I burned to say but if one word, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltiness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. This is a very well-constructed house." In rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. "I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together." And here, through a mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which held in my hand upon a very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of my wife. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered with a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long and continuous scream. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant, the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen scout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder. I had walled up the monster within the tomb.